Welcome to this week's episode of Reading the Gospels Through Hebrew Eyes. We're going to be taking a look at Matthew chapter 10 today, beginning around verse 21. This is actually the second in a three-part series of readings on Matthew chapter 10, and I had all good intentions to do a video last week on the beginning part of Matthew chapter 10, but, well, let's just say my internet provider and I had a disagreement as to whether that should happen or not. So I'm back with internet this week, so I'm looking forward to working our way through this second section of what Jesus says to the apostles when he sends them out to announce the kingdom to the people of Israel, which is really the focus of this part of the apostolic mission. So later on at the end of Matthew, of course, you're going to have Jesus sending them out to the Gentiles, to all nations. But at this point anyway, Jesus is going to send out the 12 to the people of Israel. And of course, the numerical symbolism of 12 is obvious. You have 12 tribes of Israel. And so this is Yahweh in the flesh, Jesus the Messiah, who gathers around him these 12 who are, as it were, symbolic of the 12 patriarchs of Israel, who are announcing the fact that all the promises given to Israel in the Old Testament have now come to fulfillment in Jesus of Nazareth, the anointed one of God. And what they're going to do is they're going to announce the kingdom, they're going to heal the sick, they're going to raise the dead, they're going to do all those things that are talked about in those first few verses of Jesus' instructions to his apostles. Now, a lot of the focus of this reading for this coming Sunday is really the opposition that the apostles are going to encounter when they go out to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. They're going to be persecuted, they're going to be hounded, they're going to be treated with contempt, and all manner of very negative kinds of things. Now, we're going to get to the verses in just a minute, but as we do, I want you to keep in mind how much this is patterned after the prophetic vocation. Because how were the prophets treated? Well, they were rejected. God sent prophet after prophet after prophet to Israel, and prophet after prophet after prophet, for the most part, was not listened to, persecuted, even martyred. So kind of keep that Old Testament big background of prophetic rejection in mind as you're hearing what Jesus says to these apostles. So we'll get going here with just picking up the language of the beginning of verse 5, and then we'll jump to verse 21 with the continuation of these instructions that Jesus gives to his apostles. So Matthew 10, 5a, and then 21 through 23. These 12 Jesus sent out, instructing them, "Brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. For truly, I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes." Now, in next week's video, which is going to pick up where we leave off in this video, there's going to be a more explicit connection to Micah chapter 7. But already here, we're hearing echoes of what Micah says in chapter 7, his prophetic oracle. So we'll take a look at the parallel of language just briefly now, and we'll pick up with that next week. So this is Micah chapter 7, and I'm only going to highlight a few things. So Jesus is talking about family member turning against family member. So brother delivering brother to death, father, child, children against parents, putting them to death. So, of course, this is an intensity of persecution that is just about as bad as it gets when your own family turns against you. Now, this language is picked up from Micah, where he talks about, and this whole chapter really is worth looking at, but just I have a few verses here. The godly have perished from the earth. There's no upright among mankind. The best of them, not the worst, but the best of them is like a briar. The most upright, a thorn hedge. So Micah, surveying people around him, seeing a lack of fidelity and a profusion of infidelity, says this: "Don't put your trust in a neighbor. Have no confidence in a friend. Guard the doors of your mouth from her who lies in your arms," so even from your wife. "For," and here is the most important connection between what Jesus says and then what Micah says, "for the son treats the father with contempt, the daughter rises up against her mother, the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the men of his own house. But," Micah says, As for me, I will look to the Lord. So, kind of bearing that in mind as we work our way through here, we can see that there's going to be all kinds of turmoil, all kinds of persecution, all kinds of opposition. Now, ask yourself, why do people hate those whom Jesus sends out? Well, this is an important point to bear in mind. Jesus says, you'll be hated all for my name's sake. So throughout the Old Testament, beginning already with Genesis chapter 4 and Cain and Abel, but all the way through the prophetic ministry, leading up to the coming of the Messiah, various people of God or spokesmen of God, prophets, priests, are rejected, hated, killed. Why? Because people are angry at God. They're rejecting God. They're rejecting His word. They're rejecting His truth. They're rejecting His warning. And yet they take it out on the people of God. And so when Jesus says, you'll be hated by all for my name's sake, or you're going to suffer these things for my name's sake, that's what He's talking about. Because you're connected with me, and because people are angry with me, or they're rejecting me, they're then going to reject you. And so this persecution of the spokespeople of God is going to be perpetuated in the lives of the apostles, just like prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and others were rejected. And also, just kind of bear this in mind too, and this is more of an application to today. I don't think that we should ever be worried in the church when persecution comes, because that is pretty standard. The world is never going to be applauding the church, and if it does, then we should sit up and take notice, because that is not a good sign. Typically, the world is going to stand opposed to the church. Now, maybe silently, maybe vocally, maybe even violently. But anytime the world stands up and applauds the church, then we should take that as at least an initial symbol of something which is not good, something we need to take stock of, because the world and the church are typically at odds with their big and even small perspectives on what matters and what truth is. Now, one more thing I want to highlight here, and I have it underlined in this slide, is when they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. In other words, don't seek martyrdom. And it might seem strange to modern ears, but there have been occasions in the church's history when people actually wanted to be martyred. Jesus says, listen, be brave, be courageous, trust in me, all that kind of stuff, but don't be fools. Don't walk out there and ask to be martyred. So if they persecute you one place, well then be brave for sure, but be prudent and go to the next town. Don't wait around until they kill you. So don't seek martyrdom. Instead, seek to be brave and seek to be faithful. Now, there's a line toward the end of the section that I just read that's confusing to people. So let's take a minute and just talk about it. So this is when Jesus, after he says, flee to the next town if they persecute you in one, he says, truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Now, if you look on your screen on the right-hand side, I've got a quote from Daniel chapter 7, which is where we have the language of the Son of Man coming into his kingdom. There's thrones that are set up, not one, but thrones that are set up. And then what does Daniel see in these night visions? He says, behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. He came to the Ancient of Days, was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and a glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So when I hear the language of the coming of the Son of Man, I don't hear this as in reference to his coming again, but rather coming into his kingdom, coming to the Ancient of Days and receiving from the Ancient of Days his authority to be the one who sits on this other throne beside the Ancient of Days, the Son beside his Father, and receiving from him this authority to be the head of the king of this kingdom that encompasses all peoples. So when I hear what Jesus is saying here in the bigger perspective of his ministry, of his life, death, resurrection, and ascension and enthronement to the right hand of the Father, what I hear him saying is that I will be the Son of Man who comes to the Ancient of Days and receives my kingdom. All this is going to happen before you will go through all of the cities and villages of Judea, all of the mission that's going to go to the Israelites. In other words, this coming of the Son of Man is not a second coming. but it's rather his coming into his kingdom as a fulfillment of Daniel chapter 7. Now, there's other interpretations out there, but that's the way that I'm taking it based upon the language of Daniel chapter 7, which is not about the second coming, but about the Messiah's enthronement as King of Kings at the Father's right hand. Now, let's move on to these next few verses. This is 24 through 25. Jesus goes on, "A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for the disciple to be like his teacher, and the servant like his Kyrios," which is translated here as master, and in a nice sort of way. Kyrios is also the word for Lord. It's a word that's applied to Jesus multiple times. So master or Lord, Kyrios, servant like his Kyrios. If they have called the master of the house, and I put the Greek here just in case you think maybe it's the same Greek word in both cases. It's not. So master here is Kyrios, master of the house is actually one word in Greek. Oikodespotes. So the head of the head guy who is over a household, master of the house. So if they've called the master of the house Beelzebul, we'll discuss that in just a second, how much more will they malign those of his household? So, of course, the main point here is, listen, if they've treated me this way, then don't think that you're going to be treated any way differently. If they've treated the master that way, that's exactly the way they're going to treat the servants. If they've treated the teacher this way, this is the way they're going to treat his students. So it's not as if you get to lead an un-Christ-like life. Now, as I was not received, so very often you will not be received. My life, in other words, is the pattern for yours, which is one of the reasons that when we talk about the life of a Christian, we often describe it in terms of crucifixion and resurrection. We are conformed to the life of Jesus. We're co-crucified with him and co-raised with him. Co-crucified, co-raised. So there's this daily dying and daily rising. And very often, the opposition that we face as Christians is the same kind of opposition that Christ himself faced. And that's why, for instance, when Saul was out persecuting the church, when Jesus appeared to him, he didn't say, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting my church?" He said, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Because the body of Christ, the church, and Christ himself are joined inextricably as one flesh, just like a husband and wife. And so our life is patterned after that of Christ. We are students like our teacher. We are servants like our Kyrios. Now, who is this Beelzebul? Well, here we have a Hebrew background. So if you go back to 2 Kings chapter 1, there's reference to a Philistine god in the city of Ekron. This is one of the cities in the Pentapolis of the Philistines there along the Mediterranean, who is referred to as Beelzebul, which literally means Lord of the Flies. Now, this is probably a name that's been changed so that it has a pejorative meaning that this is not the original name. It's like a pejorative nickname that's been given to this Philistine god in the city of Ekron. And that original name was probably Beelzebul, which means Baal the Prince or Baal of the Exalted Abode. But as the Hebrews like to give these pejorative nicknames to these false deities, and so they will often change it slightly to mean something which is negative. So Baal the Prince or Baal of the Exalted Abode becomes Baal of the Flies. And this happens, for instance, with a guy who's one of Saul's sons who's named Ishbaal. That's his given name. But he's frequently referred to as Ishbosheth. So instead of man of Baal, it's man of shame. Ishbosheth, man of shame. Now, that's the Old Testament background. By the time that you get to the New Testament, Beelzebul has become the name for the Lord of demons. That is for Satan. But that's kind of the background of this particular name. So this is just another section highlighting the fact that Jesus says, if you're one of my disciples, then expect to be like your teacher. If you're one of my servants, expect to be like your master. And if they've called me Beelzebul, if they referred to me as Satan, don't think that they're going to have a lot of nice names by which to refer to you. So that's that section. Let's go on to verses 26 and 27. Jesus says, so, therefore, because, in other words, because this is going to be the case, then don't be afraid. Have no fear of them. You're forewarned So also be courageous. Don't be afraid of them, because nothing is kalupto, nothing is covered that will not be apokalupto. And that's, of course, if kalupto, apokalupto, that's a play on words, which is really not captured that well in the ESV here. It really should be translated something like, have no fear of them, for nothing is covered that will not be uncovered. But instead they have revealed. So nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered. Nothing is kalupto that will not be apokalupto. That's where we get our word apocalypse from. Nothing covered that will not be uncovered, or hidden that will not be known. What I tell you in the dark, say in the light, and what you hear whispered, proclaim on the rooftops. So this is just in general Jesus saying, first of all, everything that they might do is going to eventually be made known. I think that's kind of one import of those words. But also, nothing that has been given to you, maybe in private or not in my public preaching, that's not going to be hidden either. Because whatever you've heard from me, whatever truth has been made known, I don't want you to keep this secret. I don't want you to just kind of whisper this. I want you to go up on a rooftop, and of course, keep in mind that in this part of the world, most of the rooftops were flat, and so people slept up there. They did a lot of things on their rooftop. So if you're standing on the rooftop and you're proclaiming something, then everybody down below is going to hear it. Just think of it as this, like one of those big pulpits as you'll sometimes see in the old churches that are like 12 feet above the rest of the congregation. That's kind of the idea here. Except here, the pulpit is a flat rooftop. So whatever you've heard whispered, go up on the rooftop, and I want you to proclaim that publicly and loudly. I want everything to be made known to those to whom you preach. And by the way, when Jesus says, don't be afraid or fear not, this is the beginning of 3 of these kinds of encouragements not to be afraid. So here we have no fear of them. And if you go on to the section we're going to look at next, he says, do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. And then a couple more verses, he's going to say, fear not, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. So don't be afraid. Listen, everything that's going to happen, I've told you about beforehand. So there's not going to be any surprises. And also keep in mind that whatever's done to you, I know. I'm going to see that. And also bear in mind that whatever you have heard, I want you to make it known publicly, loudly, in order that those to whom you are sent to preach may be able to hear my word as you announce my kingdom to them. And hopefully they hear and they repent and they believe. Now, next section. This is verses 28 through 31. Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy, and here we have a different Greek verb, who can destroy both body and soul in hell. And we'll look at the Greek word gehenna in just a second. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? And not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. But even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. So first of all, Jesus is making the point that, listen, they can do to you whatever they want. They can slap you around. They can taunt you. They can insult you. They can arrest you. They can even kill you. They can kill the body. However, and this is worth pondering, there are many worse things, or there's at least a worse thing for sure, than being killed physically. And that is, Jesus says, don't be afraid of that. Don't be afraid of those who are going to maybe take your life. Rather, if you're going to be afraid of something, fear the one who can destroy both body and soul in Gehenna, in hell. In other words, don't be afraid of people. What's the worst they can do to you? Kill you? All right, well, then you're with me. Rather, if you're going to fear anything, then fear God. Fear God, because if you don't believe, if you reject Christ, if you reject his kingdom, then he can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna. Well, what is Gehenna? It's usually translated here in the New Testament as hell, and rightly so. Its background here in the Old Testament is, first of all, it's geographical. I've discussed this in previous videos. So the Greek is basically just a transliteration of the Hebrew. So Gehenna is from Gehinnom. Gehinnom is the valley of Hinnom, sometimes referred to as the valley of the son or sons of Hinnom. This is right outside Jerusalem. And there's multiple occasions, you can read about these in Jeremiah, for instance, where terrible idolatrous practices occurred in the valley of Hinnom, such as child sacrifice. And so through Jeremiah, God says he's going to turn the valley of Hinnom into the valley of slaughter because of all the just wicked idolatrous events that are taking place there. Now, over time, the valley of Hinnom, right outside Jerusalem, came to be so associated with violence and bloodshed that it became symbolic of the place of eternal punishment, of eternal destruction, that is hell. So that by the time we get to the New Testament, the Valley of Hinnom, which again originally referred to a geographical location, becomes the place, the name itself, that's applied to hell. And so Gehenna in the New Testament is usually translated as hell. Now, Jesus says, so first of all, that part. Then he goes on to say that are not these two sparrows sold for a penny. Now, I don't think penny's a very good translation anymore because maybe it was at one point a long time ago, but monetary values have changed. So first of all, the Greek here is asarion. And an asarion, though, even though it's traditionally translated as penny, means something different. So a small copper, asarion was a small copper coin, and it was worth 1/16 of a denarius. Well, how much is that? Well, a denarius is how much you got paid for one day's work. And so, roughly speaking, this would be an asarion would be the equivalent of about half an hour's pay, now, depending upon how much average person, an employee gets paid. That would determine how we're going to translate this. But at least we need to say a few dollars, because nobody makes 2 pennies an hour for their work. But anyway, that's the traditional translation of it. But just keep in mind when you hear this word penny, asarion is the Greek, and it refers to a half an hour's pay. So I would translate that are not a couple sparrows sold for a few bucks, we might say. So these birds were presumably for physical consumption. I can't imagine there's much meat there, but anyway, that's what it's referring to. So Jesus says, "Are you not much more valuable than they?" Of course you are. It's an argument common in the Bible from lesser to greater. So these are worth something. You're worth infinitely more. And then as another comparison, he uses the image of the hairs of your head being numbered. He says, even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Now, as you can see from the quotes on the screen, this image of the hairs of your head falling to the ground or not falling to the ground, or this idea that they're all numbered by God and each of them are significant. Well, that's taken from the Old Testament. For instance, 1 Samuel 14:45, this is when Saul had sworn the ridiculous oath, and the people said to him, Jonathan is not going to die. He's worked great salvation in Israel. So as the Lord lives, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. Or, similarly, 1 Kings chapter 1, Solomon said, if he will show himself a worthy man, not one of his hairs shall fall to the earth. But if wickedness is found in him, he shall die. So this idea of God knowing the hairs of our head or not one of them falling to the ground, this has an Old Testament connection here. And of course, it's God, it's Jesus' way of accenting the fact that you are known intimately. You are known so well, in fact, that God knows how many hairs are on your head, or in some people's case, not on your head. And so that kind of knowledge, coupled with the fact that we are of much more value than these sparrows, is just simply a rhetorical way of underlining the fact that we are precious to our Father. And no matter what happens to us, then we are going to be preserved by Him. Now, the last section, verses 32 and 33, is where we will wrap up here. So everyone who acknowledges me before men, I also will acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I also will deny before my Father who is in heaven. This is stating nothing more than what ought to be blatantly obvious, that those who want to have nothing to do with Christ, those who deny him, reject him, that's exactly how they will be treated by Christ. They want nothing to do with Christ. Christ says, okay, well, there you go. You will have nothing to do with me. Those who acknowledge him, those who confess him, those who believe in him, they will also be acknowledged and confessed as believers by Christ. Now, you might be asking yourself, okay, but what if somebody does sin by denying Christ? Have they committed the unpardonable sin, for instance? Is this the sin against the Holy Spirit? Or is there any hope left for me if I have denied Christ? Absolutely, there certainly is, because the same Greek word, arneomai, which is translated as deny, is the same verb that's used to apply to Peter in this same gospel in Matthew chapter 26. Of course, this is the night when Jesus is betrayed and he's been arrested, and Peter is sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Galilean," but he arneoed it. He denied it before them, saying, "I don't know what you mean." And when he went out to the entrance, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again, he arneomai. He denied it, and this time with an oath, "I do not know the man." Peter denied Christ. And yet, what did Christ do? He restored Peter. In John's gospel, he asked him 3 times, "Peter, do you love me?" Jesus forgave Peter. In fact, he told him, that this was going to happen. And Peter, of course, steadfastly refused to believe that he would ever be so weak or frightened as to do that. But he did. So, if you've denied Christ and you're fearful that maybe there's no hope for you, be of good cheer. Confess your sins and know that Christ has died for that sin of denial as well. So confess it and acknowledge Christ. Believe in him and rest in the forgiveness that he gives to you. Well, that's it for this week. That's not the end of Jesus' instructions to his apostles. We'll pick up with the rest of those next week, but it's enough to chew on for now. Good to be back, and hopefully my internet service will continue unabated. We shall see. Thanks for watching. If it's been helpful to you, pass it on to your friends, and I pray that our good and gracious Lord may watch over all of you, may bless you and your families and your congregations with his unlimited grace. We'll see you soon.